Okay, here goes. I'm going to call the meeting to order, and I am continuing to let people in from the waiting room. So if there's a pause from me, it's because I'm trying to manage a couple of different things. And Kelly, just so you know, I've designated you as a co-host. So if you want to continue to let people in from the waiting room, that would be greatly appreciated.
Surely.
So I think there's one person waiting now, if you can kind of let them in. All right, so I'm going to call the meeting to order. Thank you all for your patience here. I essentially have to read a script according to the City of Madison, so just bear with me as I work through this language. So, welcome to our virtual meeting. We're going to cover a few basic items before beginning. If you lose connection at any point during the meeting, you can reconnect by clicking the link or calling the number in your original email. To members and city staff, members, if you are able, please activate your video and keep it on for the duration of the meeting. Staff, if you are able, please activate your video when you are speaking. Same for speakers. Speakers that have been invited for this meeting, you don't need to have your camera on until you're giving that presentation, okay? I will be responsible, or Kelly, who's co-facilitating this with me, will be responsible for muting and unmuting committee members. Please use the raise hand feature. It should be on the lower bar of your screen when you'd like to be recognized to speak or ask questions. Staff, click raise hand when you are asked a question. The chair will do their best to call on committee members in the order in which the hands are raised. Lowering your hand will take you out of the queue. All right, so I'm going to do the roll call right now for committee members. All right, I saw a hand up, but it went down. Okay, so I'm just going to run through the roll call. Sharon Long. Jocelyn Hemming.
Here.
Jocelyn is present. Greg Harrington.
Present.
Greg Harrington is present. Janet Batista. Janet, you need to unmute yourself. Okay.
There it is. Okay.
There you go.
I'm
Thank
here.
you. Janet is present. Henry Anderson.
I'm here.
Henry Anderson is present. Gary Grinke.
Here.
Thank you, Gary. So right now we have 5 of 6 members. Just Sharon Long is not present. Also on this call, we do have a number of water utility employees, just so people are aware. We'll recognize them as they enter the discussion as we go along. All right. In a virtual meeting like this, it is particularly important that we follow an adopted set of rules. Therefore, please do not speak until you have raised your hand and been recognized. The chair or I will ask for a motion and second for each agenda item, unless it is noticed for discussion only. Any member wishing to join the debate or move an amendment will also have to raise their hand or be recognized by the chair. Similarly, if you have some other matter to bring to the attention of the chair, such as a point of order or request for information, please use the raised hand function. So Kelly and I will be following that and doing that as we work through this meeting. Okay. So just a couple of housekeeping, agenda repair or announcements with respect to public comment. For those of you who have called in or are watching the meeting, thank you for engaging with the activities of this committee. You You may note there is no public comment period on the agenda. Speaking at this committee is limited to committee members, staff, and invited guests. Because your viewpoint is important, and if you want to express that viewpoint, please submit written comments to the committee at water@madisonwater.org. All comments will be shared with committee members. Furthermore, the Water Utility Board regularly meets on the fourth Tuesday of each month, and public comment is taken at those meetings. The next Water Utility Board meeting is set for January 26th at 4:30. There will also be a virtual meeting. Just as a reminder, we do have our next meeting will be Monday, April 12th. The meeting after that is tentatively scheduled for July 12th. And then finally, our last scheduled meeting of the year is Monday, October 11th. Again, just wanted to highlight that our next meeting is scheduled for April 12th. Did want to talk as one announcement. A committee member asked that we talk about some personnel changes at the water utility. As many of you may know, Tom Hakenen has retired from the water utility, and I have been appointed by the mayor as the interim general manager. I have also delegated my supervisory and administrative responsibilities within the water quality section to Kelly Meese. Kelly Meese is, like I said, is joining us here today. In addition, Chief Engineer and Assistant General Manager Al Larson, who's also on the call, will be retiring next month after 20 years of serving the utility in the city. He has served on this committee since its inception and has been a valuable member of the water utility team, as well as serving the city of Madison. And then finally, we are currently. There's Al. I don't have any remarks specifically to recognizing all the accomplishments and all of the accolades that Al is responsible for, but I suspect that there'll be opportunities in the future for that. And then finally, the last personnel change or staffing change at the water utility that I'd like to comment at this point is that we are deep in the recruitment process to fill the financial manager position, and we currently have interviews that are being conducted later this week. So that is a position that we are working to fill. Any comments or questions in regards to that brief update on staffing changes at the water utility? All right. Then I will move ahead with the next item on the agenda, which is the approval of the minutes. And so at this point, I would accept a motion for approval.
So moved.
We have a motion
Need a second? I'll second it.
by Greg and seconded by Henry. Is there any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor of approving the minutes as written from our previous meeting, October 12th, 2020 meeting? If you could just raise your hand using the raise hand function. All right. The motion is approved. So the minutes are approved as written. Thank you. Right now, we'll move on to our new business, and the first item on the agenda is the fluoride review, and we'll have a presentation by Wisconsin Department of Health Services staff. Just want to do a brief introduction that this presentation will be a continuation of our discussion that we began last year to review our fluoridation practices in light of new research questioning the toxicity of fluoride. Our review was initiated at least in part by the release of the National Toxicology Program's systematic review of fluoride exposure in neurodevelopment and cognitive health effects, which is currently being reviewed by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. I've invited staff from the Wisconsin Department of Health Services to make a presentation on fluoride toxicity. Before I turn over the floor to Department of Health Services staff, I'd like to briefly discuss the regulations surrounding fluoride in drinking water. Community fluoridation is not required of community water systems. It is a choice made by individual communities. If a community opts to add fluoride, there are operational requirements that the utility must follow, including equipment, testing, and safety. These requirements are found in Wisconsin Administrative Code, Chapter NR 811. I will note also that there is a primary drinking water standard, or MCL, which stands for maximum contaminant level, set at 4 milligrams per liter, and a secondary MCL set at 2 milligrams per liter. The secondary standard is set for cosmetic effects, in other words, generally the staining of teeth, while the primary MCL was established for health effects such as skeletal fluorosis, which I believe Department of Health Services staff are likely to discuss in this presentation. With this general foundation, I will turn the floor over to Dr. Russ Dunkel to introduce himself and other Department of Health Services staff.
Thank you, Joe, and good evening, everyone. As Joe mentioned, and many of you already know, I'm Dr. Russ Dunkel, I'm Wisconsin State Dental Director, and I will be speaking second. What I'd like to do is turn it over to one of my colleagues, Dr. Sarah Yang, who's going to get more into the science of the NTP report. And so go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you. I'm going to see if my screen will share here. So let me know if you can see my slide.
You're good, Sarah. Yep.
Awesome. Always good when things work out. That weird message. Okay, so I'm Dr. Sarah Yang. I'm the groundwater toxicologist with the Wisconsin Department of Health Services. And so my role is really to work as a liaison, a technical advisor for several different programs and local partners across the state. So we work with Department of Natural Resources, with cities, counties, to help address any sort of drinking water or groundwater health related concerns. Today I'm going to be talking specifically about the NTP report that came out just not too long ago. There have been several drafts, so we'll talk about dates and stuff too. But really going to kind of focus on some things to consider when looking at this report and the data that's presented within this report. Joining Russ and I on the call is also a fellow epidemiology fellow, Ezra, and so he's going to help address any questions we have if we get any questions on specific epidemiology studies. So just going to do a little introduction about fluoride, and then we're going to have a quick overview of the 2020 draft report, talk a little bit about the animal studies that they reviewed, the human studies, and then some factors to consider when evaluating this report specifically, and then we'll wrap up. So as we're likely aware, fluoride is used because it protects teeth. It protects teeth from decay, specifically by inhibiting or reversing dental caries or cavities, and it can also increase bone growth. So it's been used in public water systems since at least the 1960s to promote healthy teeth. Fluoride is a mineral, and it's naturally found in a lot of different environments. So it can be found in small amounts in soil, water, and food products. It's added to things like drinking water or toothpaste or other products to help promote that dental health, as we talked about. And Russ will talk a little bit more about that aspect after this presentation. I'm going to focus on toxicology and that NTP study. So the one important thing that I want to point out is that, like many substances that we are exposed to regularly, we continue to learn about the health effects of fluoride. So this is by no way something that we know every single thing about or know, how this is all of the mechanisms behind how it acts in the body. There are studies that just came out in 2020. There are, NTP added 35 new studies in a year because that's how many have come out recently. So this is definitely something that we continue to learn about. As such, I wanted to ensure you that DHS actively follows this research to make sure that the policies that we recommend at the state level are based on this best available information. So again, today's focus is really going to be talking about this draft NTP monograph on the systematic review of fluoride exposure and neurodevelopmental and cognitive effects. And another one? So just to give you a little bit of background about this report, the first draft was released by NTP in September of 2019. Then NASEM, the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Math, reviewed this and came out with their comments in March of 2020. Then this past September, NTP updated their draft, taking into consideration those comments from NASEM. So we're currently at the stage where NASEM is reviewing this latest draft. They're expected to release their updated review early this year. And then, once they release that review, NTP will take those comments into consideration and release a final monograph. Now, these timelines are obviously subject to change depending on resources and availability at the federal level. But I just wanted to point out really that this is still a draft, and it's a draft that's being actively reviewed by a very high level academy within the United States. So when we look at the big picture, what did NTP say about fluoride? This is kind of the takeaway conclusion. They said that when considering all the evidence, including studies with exposures to fluoride levels higher than 1.5 milligrams per liter in water, NTP concludes that that fluoride is presumed to be a cognitive neurodevelopmental hazard to humans. And this is what they said in their most recent draft. So again, it might not be the final conclusion they come to, but this is their draft conclusion. So we're going to break this down a little bit more and talk about what that means. So just a little bit background. The objective of this report was to develop hazard conclusions about whether fluoride exposure is associated with neurodevelopmental and cognitive effects. Now I'm going to point out here that they were, their goal was to just basically say yes or no. Is there evidence of this? It wasn't to determine at what level those effects occur, which is really key in terms of toxicology. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on here. So the methods that they use is that they reviewed published studies on the effects of fluoride on neurodevelopment and cognition, neurobehavior, and then thyroid, because there is some evidence to suggest that thyroid changes might be the mechanism behind these neurodevelopmental changes. And the results of their search is that they found 339 animal studies that fell into one of these three bins, 159 human studies, and 60 studies in cell cultures or in vitro studies. And they took these studies and divided them into three categories by the effect. So they're really looking for this neurodevelopment and cognition effects, that top box, which relates to learning, memory, and intelligence. But they also found studies about neurobehavior, so things like anxiety, aggression, motor activity, biochemistry, and thyroid. Mostly hormone levels, but perhaps some other studies as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about the animal studies and what they found. So of the animal studies, 23% of these related to neurodevelopment and cognition. So that's 79 studies of the over 300 that they reviewed. But they concluded that the animal data is inadequate to evaluate the effects of fluoride in learning and memory. And they concluded this for two main reasons. Weird. Okay. First reason is indirectness, and then the second reason was risk of bias. So for indirectness, they concluded that many learning and memory tests rely on a motor response, and it's difficult to separate these learning and memory effects from the effects on memory activity or motor coordination. So it was hard in an animal to figure out what's really learning effects versus the other ways that you had to test for that effect. And then for risk of bias, they concluded that many studies lacked randomization, blinding exposure information, controls for litter effects, expected response and controls, and reporting other key information. So there was, even though there was this large number of studies, the quality of these studies were really lacking. And so for those reasons, they decided that animal studies could not be used to answer this specific question over neurodevelopmental effects. So then they turned to the human studies. So by human studies, we mean epidemiological studies, studies that have been conducted among people to evaluate different effects. So they looked at 159 studies. They determined that 93 of these studies related to neurodevelopment and cognition. 26 of them evaluated the effects on children. And they used 19 studies to draw their conclusions. This is based on low risk of bias from all the studies. So they looked at all the studies, they figured out which ones really relate to the question we're asking, and then which ones are the highest quality studies. And that resulted in 19 studies used to make that conclusion that there's moderate evidence for neurodevelopmental effects in people. So I guess some things that I wanted to bring to your attention, some factors that I want you to consider when you're looking at this report and you're looking at the data and the conclusions that NTP is making, is that we need to consider a lot of factors when we're using data to make public health decisions, like should we use fluoride or not. Some of these factors, and these are by no means all the factors we need to consider when we're looking at data, but some of them include that dose-response relationship I was mentioning before. Regional differences in the study design, and external variables. So I'm going to talk about each of these features a little bit more. So I'm going to talk about dose-response relationship. Again, keeping in mind that NTP wasn't tasked with figuring out where there is a safe level of fluoride. They were tasked with determining if there is evidence of neurodevelopmental toxicity. So of the studies that they reviewed, of those 19 studies in children, 13 of those reported fluoride levels in drinking water. But when they did their meta-analysis, which was included because of Nason's most recent comments, they only used 2 studies to evaluate exposure from drinking water. So again, that is out of the 339 studies in people, they used 2 to come up with attempt to come up with a quantitative risk of fluoride from drinking water. So I really would caution about, we need more data. We need to look into these health effects more clearly. The dose makes a poison. I guess that's the principle of toxicology. That's what's been ingrained in me since I got my PhD. So I think that's definitely something that's relevant here. The next thing to consideration is regional differences. Now, it's not necessarily a problem when studies aren't conducted within the country where we live, but we want to make sure that the exposures are relevant to the people that we're trying to protect. So all of the studies that were conducted, those 19 studies that were reviewed, they were all this might be the 26 studies because they looked at both 19 and 26 studies. But of those studies, they were all conducted outside of the United States. Most were conducted in China, and then Mexico, Canada, India, and Iran. Now, the thing that comes to mind in this is that there are definitely known regional differences and high levels of fluoride in certain parts of the world, more so than in other parts. And this is a map from a 2006 study showing the probability of fluoride concentrations exceeding 1.5 milligrams per liter, which again is the WHO, the World Health Organization's recommendation for fluoride health guidelines. So the darkest blue is like the greatest probability of having fairly high levels of fluoride, just background naturally in drinking water. So as you can see, China, India, unfortunately my legend is apparently covering parts of Mexico. I'm sorry about that. But certain parts of the world definitely have higher concentrations of fluoride naturally occurring than the U.S. And you can see within the U.S., there's definitely some areas in the U.S. that have a likelihood to have high natural fluoride, but it's not necessarily as endemic as other parts of the world. Which I think plays into the study design question. So there are several different types of epidemiological studies. Three that I'm going to talk about a little bit here are cross-sectional, cohort, and case control studies. Now, one thing I want to know is that the study design can really impact the type of data or the quality of data you can get out of a study. So when we are looking at a population, if we don't have necessarily a control population that's not exposed to the same conditions, it's hard to make a conclusion as to what exactly was responsible for that thing you're looking into. So a cross-sectional study looks at a subset of the population and tries to figure out what's happening in this population. And that's usually done at one point in time. Now, a cohort study is usually can be like a prospective cohort study, and where it's usually when you're following a group of people over a period of time to see what kind of factors that they're exposed to or happen to them over their lifetime and how those factors can affect their health outcomes. And then there's a case control studies. This is where we have two populations. One population that's exposed to the thing we're trying to learn about, and the other population that's not, and then we can compare between them. Now, all of these studies have their pluses and minuses. Cross-sectional studies are really good to get that baseline understanding, kind of where should we look from, where are some potential problems, where should we do some more research. Really the bread and butter studies to try to figure out a cause and effect relationship is these case control studies. Now, they're hard to do. They take time. They take a lot of effort. So, there's usually less case control studies than there are other types of study design. Just to point this out, so of those 19 studies that were used to make that confidence determination by NTP, 5 of those were prospective cohort studies, so following a group of people over a period of time, and then 14 were cross-sectional studies. And there weren't any case control studies. So just something to take into consideration of. And then the final thing that I'll talk about a little bit is external variables. So especially when we're talking about studies in people where we can't control every single thing that they do like we can in a research animal, there's all these different variables that we have to take into account when we're doing a statistical analysis of the data. And, it's very unlikely and probably resource intensive to control for every single variable that could possibly influence the study outcome or health risk. So this is a diagram showing the different variables that were controlled for in those 26 studies that were reviewed by NTP. So we have studies relating to the subject, so the child in question, studies relating to their factors relating to their environmental exposure, things that affect the parents, and then socioeconomic status. So you can see age and sex were controlled for in almost all of the studies. Race and ethnicity was not, which might be surprising to us here in America, but many of these studies were done in China or a country where maybe there's not as much difference in race and ethnicity as there is in the US. Arsenic exposure and lead exposure, these are contaminants that we know can cause neurodevelopmental issues. So these were controlled for in 3/4, a little bit more than that, of the studies, roughly 3/4. Iodine and smoking were less considered. And then parental characteristics weren't as well taken into consideration. Only one of these studies controlled for parental IQ. So just something to keep into consideration. There was a good control for socioeconomic status, with 92% of studies controlling for that, but less controlling for the home environment. What does home look like? So we're just going to all together summarize what we've talked about today. And so first thing is that NTP's draft conclusion is that fluoride is presumed to be a cognitive neurodevelopmental hazard to humans at levels above 1.5 milligrams per liter. Now, we know that a number of factors should be considered when determining how to use data to make public health decisions. And we want to let you know that DHS is committed to following this research, make sure that Wisconsin policies are based on that best available data. So I don't know, Russ, if you want to go first or if we want to take any questions on this presentation now. What do people kind of think?
Joe, what is your thought as facilitator? Do you want to hold questions till the end?
Why don't we do that unless somebody has a burning question? So if there's somebody on the committee who has a burning question that they'd like to ask right now, or if you can hold your questions to the end. I'm not seeing anybody raising their hand, Russ, so why don't you go ahead?
Okay, sounds good. Is my screen coming up, Joe?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, as I mentioned before, my name is Dr. Russ Dunkel. I'm the Wisconsin State Dental Director. And this, just as a little clarity on what Sarah had mentioned before, is that fluoride is a naturally occurring mineral. It's the 13th most abundant mineral in the Earth's crust. Surface water or river water, the typical concentrations are around 0.2 milligrams per milliliter or liter, or parts per million or less. Groundwater wells, for example, typically have higher concentrations that can be from 0.1 milligram per liter all the way up to over 5.0 milligrams per liter. And ocean water typically is 0.8 to 1.4 milligrams per liter. Just to briefly go over how fluoride works, it has two effects. There's the topical effect from outside the tooth. This is from saliva, fluoridated toothpaste, and other topical products. And there's a systemic effect from inside and outside of the tooth. And also part of that systemic effect also includes saliva that's bathing the teeth enamel 24/7. That's fluoride that's released through the saliva in the mouth. And it's key to note that adults also benefit rather than only children, as was once assumed. So this kind of goes over some studies that have addressed the issue about what happens when community fluoride ends. One major study that was done was in Juneau, Alaska, and this was by determined dental disease among preschool age kids increased, requiring an average of one additional dental procedure per child. And I'll go into that in a little more detail. Calgary, Canada, did a comparison between Calgary and Edmonton, showing the difference between a community that discontinued community water fluoridation and a community that maintained community water fluoridation, and the increase in decay in the city that discontinued the community water fluoridation. Another study is in Windsor, Canada, where cavity rates increased by 51% in a 5-year period of time. Now, it's important to note that in the Windsor, Canada study, it is not considered a scientific study. This was done in 2013. The city of Windsor, the city council had decided in a vote of 8-3, I believe, to discontinue community water fluoridation. But what they also did is they said that we will study this over a 5-year period of time. So it's not a scientific or peer-reviewed study. It was a study that was performed and authorized by the city of Windsor. What they noticed is after a 5-year period of time that they saw an increase within that 5-year period of time of cavity rates of 51%. And especially what they were noticing is in that they were seeing a lot of dental emergencies to the tune of almost $500,000 a year in increased costs to the community for hospital-based dentistry that was required because of the increase in decay. So then in 2018, the same city council voted 8-3 to actually reintroduce community water fluoridation into the community. So I'd like to go over a little bit more of the study that occurred in Juneau, Alaska. And this was published in the Biomed, get the right title for you here. Yeah, Biomed Central Oral Health, which is a peer-reviewed study. And it showed the consequences of community water fluoridation cessation for Medicaid-eligible children and adolescents in Juneau, Alaska. So what they found is that in 2007 is when Juneau decided to discontinue community water fluoridation. So what they looked at is from studying when the optimal fluoride level was in the water in 2003, then they looked at what the results were in 2012, which is 5 years after the community water fluoridation had been removed. And their results or findings were that the mean caries restoration cost, according to age for children with optimal or suboptimal community water fluoridation. First, the mean cost in 2003, as I mentioned, then the mean cost in 2003 was then adjusted for inflation according to the 2012 value, and then lastly, the increased cost attributed to suboptimal community water fluoridation. I want to go back to this one. So when you're looking at this, you can see that there was an increase in the lower age groups. Well, the reason this happened is because they had no benefit of community water fluoridation, whereas the older age participants actually had some benefit during their developmental years of exposure to community water fluoridation. So that accounts for the different level there. And this next table shows the mean caries related treatment costs by age in 2003 and 2012, and again adjusted for inflation. So you can see on the end, again, the 0 to 6 age group, there was definitely an increase in the amount of caries rate or dental costs because of suboptimal community water fluoridation. And as you get into the higher age groups, it goes down a little bit more. Now, we do see an increase in the 0 to 18, but again, that could also be adjusted for age variance, such as they may be drinking more soda and the parents have less control over that, etc. And I will allow for more questions afterwards to address this in more detail as needed. So again, evaluating the first NTP draft monograph, as Sarah gave a more in-depth presentation on, the National Academy's committee voiced substantial concerns on how NTP evaluated the evidence for its monograph about fluoride. Their statement was that the NTP needs to state clearly that the monograph is not designed to be informative regarding decisions about fluoride concentrations or for concentrations for water fluoridation. And even this conclusion has not yet been reviewed in 2020 by the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. That is still forthcoming. This is important because the previous NTP report was heavily criticized by the national academies because of the quality of the research and the analysis that it relied on. So the National Toxicology Program's report about fluoride did not find a relationship between neurotoxicity or IQ scores and fluoride at the levels that are being used for water fluoridation within the United States. The NTP only found an association at levels at, and that should be corrected, they found it at levels, they're stating that found it at levels above 1.5 parts per million, which is over twice that of fluoridated water. So I'd like to end there, and I think it's more important that we open up to questions by the committee so we can address those as needed, especially with some of the other studies that I mentioned.
Thank you, Russ and Sarah, for those informative presentations. So if you do have a question, committee members, if you would please raise your hand. And when I call on you, if you would please just make sure your camera is turned on. So, Janet, we'll start with you.
Okay, I have two questions. Well, one's not so much a question, but you pointed out that the cognitive neurodevelopment effects are pretty clear at levels above 1.5 milligrams per liter. Isn't that correct? That's in the conclusion of the 2020 report, NTP report.
I'm sorry, Janet. That's what they're stating.
That's what they're
right. Stating. I can't say that I agree with that. I do not. Right. I'm just stating what they are.
Okay, I understand, and that's what they say in the conclusion of the report. If you can read the conclusion, but that does not say that at levels at 0.7, which is our level, milligrams per liter, there are no effects. What it says in the conclusion is that at those levels, the effects are inconsistent and therefore unclear. So just by stating that over 1.5 there are effects, but not stating that at the lower level, the level that we're used to, the results are unclear and inconsistent. So you can't draw the conclusion that there are no effects at our level based on their study. That's what it says in the conclusion.
Yeah, so this is Sarah, and again, I just want to give you, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm a toxicologist by training, but the thing that stood out to me is that there are limited studies that looked at concentrations that were consistent with concentrations that we use in the U.S., that are found in Wisconsin. And in the cases that I saw where there were concentrations that were that low, they were usually considered the control group and not the exposure group. Not to say that, there weren't some studies that did see an effect at those levels. I think that the challenge, and this is constantly a challenge with using human epidemiology studies to draw a line, is that we need to consider all those variables that are controlled for, right? Just because we saw something happen, we cannot necessarily have a cause and effect relationship based on these study designs. So we really need to dig deeper into each of those studies and look at those different factors and say, was there something else going on here? Or, did we control for everything we could control for? What's the control group? What are the different exposures? It takes a lot of effort to go through each and every one of these, individual studies and try to tease out those kinds of statistical analyses. And again, when NTP did try to do that in the most recent version, again, they only used 2 studies to do their meta-analysis with drinking water exposures.
Okay, but so their conclusion, the NTP September 2020 report, is that at those levels, the results are inconsistent and therefore unclear. So anyway, that's one thing that I wanted to say. But the other question I have is, you're quoting these studies, the studies from Canada and whatnot, using mean carries that they're finding in children. Does Madison or Dane County keep any data on effects on dental health in our community? For example, we lowered the level of fluoride in our drinking water from whatever it was, 1 several years ago. Can we say that there's been a change or not? Do we have any of that data? Are we looking at that data in our community?
And unfortunately, Janet, I am not aware of any conclusive data, unfortunately, that addresses that in the Madison area.
Well, that's all I'm wondering about. I mean, it seems to me that there should be some better data for the mean carries information and local data as well. So anyway, those are the only 2 points that I had.
Ezra, do you have anything to add from an epi standpoint? Do you think?
Yeah.
Janet?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yep, sorry. So, Ezra Menon, I'm an epidemiologist with the oral health program. So my major, just kind of listening to the discussion, we can't draw a conclusion or causality. Sorry, we can't draw causality from cross-sectional studies. If we have a pyramid of studies and how influential they are, at the bottom you have these observational studies, cross-sectional, cohort, case control, and then at the top of our pyramid of studies you have experimental. And so when looking at the NTP report, the concern I have is drawing conclusions about levels from mainly cross-sectional study designs, because those are subject to their own bias, and those don't allow us to look at temporality. So we're cutting the population, we're cutting time in half and saying, okay, we're looking at these people now, and let's see, were they exposed at some point in their life? Who knows when? Whether it's the day before the study happened or whether it's the day they were born. And then we're looking at their in IQ in some cases, and we don't know whether that was evaluated at 3 to 4 years. In some cases they evaluated at that age group, but we don't know if the fluoride exposure occurred before or after. And so with some of the case control or the cohort studies, there's a little bit more evidence that they can actually gather. They can start to look at temporality with those. But my major concern with what was looked at is the study designs. Cross-sectional is fantastic for, kind of pulling out data and saying, okay, hey, we need to look at this. And so, which I think is what's been done, is the cross-sectional study brought some concerns forward. But now we need to see more data that actually allows us to actually establish some temporality, which I think is really what's missing from this.
Dr. Anderson, you're up. You're on mute, Henry.
The target here for this committee is whether the studies, like the NTP is looking at, suggest that there are support that there's neurobehavioral impacts. We're not charged to develop a drinking water or a groundwater standard. And I guess what I would ask the division, public health, despite the COVID issues going on, you've known about this for some time. Have you looked at what type of information you could generate in Madison that would potentially answer some of the questions on what are the exposures in our area? I think the issue raised by Janet, that a number of communities in Wisconsin have gone on and off fluoride. I don't think anybody's arguing that there are dental benefits. The question is, if you look at the data and the way the MCL was developed, it's based on the 1960s data and information. Is the Division of Public Health Groundwater Standards Program going to look at these various studies and then determine whether you can develop a drinking water or an advisory standard? Typically, and I would use the recent PFAS, we have human data that basically have not been able to be translated into doses that could be used in the standard for developing drinking water standards, and we're left with animal studies. So mostly human health data is not used because of all of the human issues, but when the animal toxicology data has been looked at and can't be used, you're left with the human data. So is the groundwater program or the tox program going to look at, if you were to develop a standard or an advisory for fluoride, what would it be? Is the only toxic endpoint of concern fluorosis? And that's basically what the initial standards and advisories were based on, without any other tox information. So I think that I would be interested to know, are you considering looking at, in some of these studies, looked at fluoride levels in urine. It's a pretty inexpensive test. You have the state in the university has the state Haynes program, where you have stored urine samples of a representative sample across the state. One could potentially look at those data to see what you have there, and then look at other measures that you could maybe look at. Are you considering? It's pretty glaring that all of the studies have been done, has not been done in the U.S. Can you turn that on, please?
Well, the one study, and I'll let Sarah talk, Andy, or Dr. Anderson, but the one study that I mentioned was Juneau, Alaska. So that's where they were evaluating what happened after community water fluoridation was removed or discontinued.
But
that is a U.S. study.
Yeah, but that over time, is that the same children?
Yes. Yeah, and the thing to note in the Alaskan study is that one of the things they tried to remove as a co-founder, when they were looking at that study, they were actually looking only at decay responses that they could actually prove. They removed extractions, which may have been caused by decay, but because it was hard to use that, they wanted to rule that out as a confounder. So they actually only dealt with dental decay that didn't result because they didn't want to bring in other risks of trauma or anything else that might have resulted in the need for the extraction. So that's what they were looking at specifically in that study. And they used a 2-year, two different time point analysis.
But it was on the same children. So the children at day one, they did an evaluation of what was in their mouths and whether it had been treated or not. And then it was only newly developed decay after that, or I mean, clearly some will not every child with tooth decay gets treated.
Right.
So then,
yeah, but they used Medicaid data as well. So they were using Medicaid data. So they were trying to actually also use a socioeconomic group as well to try to adjust for that as well in that study. Sarah, do you want to address the groundwater issue?
Yeah, sure. So a couple factors I guess I want to point out. One is that, we have the MCL, we have the secondary standard, but we also have this recommendation for if you're going to add fluoride for community water fluoridation, and those are completely separate things, right? The drinking water standard is protecting from health effects from too much fluoride. The recommendation for how much to add for community water fluoridation is to promote those health benefits. If a community is, naturally does not have high fluoride and is only adding fluoride for your community water fluoridation, we're not worrying, we're not going to get to levels of the MCL. So in general, that 0.7 is really going to be kind of like that bar we're using. That's not to say that the MCL, the 4, couldn't use some revisit. Typically when we're talking about a drinking water standard, we look to the federal government for that kind of advice and input on, is this number still valid? That is really difficult to do at a state level. We're trying to do it now for PFAS, and it's an uphill battle. I would say that we have not been asked from a groundwater standard perspective. So the way the groundwater standards work is that DNR puts a list together from different agencies or the public on things that they should either add to the list or update, and then DNR over time in batches will ask us to review some either recommended current standards or ask for new recommended standards. We have not been asked to do that for fluoride. I would like to point out that this NTP report is still a draft, right? We don't know what the final one's going to say. So making any sort of drastic conclusions right now, I think is not appropriate. I think we need to wait until that final report is out there and see what that says. Because, you know, there were some new analyses that were actually included in that. Those meta-analyses weren't in the first report. Like there's additional data out there that would be really helpful to have and to consider. So again, I'm not taking anything off the table, but we have not been asked to do that. Regarding your question about doing some sort of like epi study, I mean, I think Ezra could speak to this. Like, we would love to get data like that. The thing is, like, those kinds of studies cost money, and really DHS is typically in a role of supporting a researcher who would like to do those kinds of studies. We really rarely, and especially now with COVID, have the ability to take a lead on a in-depth epidemiological study like that. But, you know, if someone had an idea and got funding and came to us for some support, I think we would be happy to help them with that kind of project.
All right. Dr. Neary, if you could just briefly introduce yourself to
Okay. Yes,
Dr.
my name is Dr. Beth Neary. I'm a pediatrician here in Madison, and I'm the co-president of the Wisconsin Environmental Health Network. And one thing I want to invite you all to is that we put on a conference in February, March, and two of our speakers this year are going to be pertinent to this group. One is Dr. Christine Till, who did the research out of Canada on fluoride and neurotoxicity in association with Dr. Bruce Lampier. And then the second speaker is Dr. Linda Birnbaum, who used to be the president of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences and the president of the NTP for the last 10 years. So both of those speakers are going to be speaking at a conference. I'd like to invite you all to actually hear them firsthand. And I just want to make 2 points, and that is that we now know that the benefits of fluoride are really topical. Not to say there's no benefit from systemic, but it's minimal. The benefits truly are topical. And if you question what I'm saying, I would refer you to 2 more experts that are beyond my expertise. Dr. Pam Den-Beston, who's at DDS, and she's at UCSF as a professor. She's the president of the International Association of Dental Research. And Dr. E. Angeles Martinez-Mayer, who's at IU, and she or he is the president of the American Association of Child Health Dentistry. And I've been reading some of their research, and they basically said, we really know that the benefits are now topical, not systemic, as we believed years ago. And in that light, we've actually changed some practices, even in Madison. So children will go to the dentist, and they will get topical fluoride treatments. But now, pediatricians and family practitioners are now starting to do what they call fluoride varnishes. So once the teeth erupt, when a child goes to a practice, and usually doctors are doing it now, at 9 months, at 12 months, at 15 months, at 18 months, they're getting a dental varnish at the pediatrician's office. So I think that's important to understand that new practices are bringing fluoride to the children in different ways, and it's important to think about all those things as we look at the research. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Neary. Would you mind sending me those 2 things? You mentioned the in February, March, there's that. Can you send that information?
Definitely.
As well as the names of those 2 researchers you just identified.
I will. And actually, Dr. Birnbaum is going to be speaking on PFAS. So.
Oh, excellent. Very relevant.
And I can send you those other researchers. It would be nice to have one of them actually, because we have Zoom and you can pull in experts. It'd be nice to have one of the other dentists come and talk about the impact of fluoride.
Jeff Lafferty from Public Health, Madison, Dane County. You're up.
Yeah, I had to turn on my video real quick. Okay, so maybe I heard incorrectly, but I thought I heard that it wasn't clear that a public health reviews the studies, and if that's what the question, and I'm not going crazy, didn't hear it correctly. We have a white paper that comes out every couple of years. It's on our website. It's our policy statement where we go through various research and it's updated every year or two, and it probably should be updated sometime this year once I'm off COVID duty, because that's what I've been doing since March. And I just want to also support everything Ezra said, because he brought up a lot of good points about the cross-sectional studies. And what's disturbing to me is out of the 19 studies that were used, 14 were cross-sectional, and those are not used to determine an association. Those are mainly used to point at, hey, let's look at this further. So that's not really the best thing to draw attention to and try to draw an association from. And when it comes to a dose-response relationship, it's really hard to do that with a human study of this quality, because the water intake is estimated. So you don't really know how much someone actually drinks. So without knowing the number of how much water the person actually drank that was fluoridated, it's hard to get an actual dose to get a dose response to. And when it comes down to collecting dental care information, I'm not aware, and I don't believe we get that data systematically from local dentists. So that would be an issue just from a data sense. And also, like Sarah pointed out, it would be money and funding, which, I mean, we're all going to have a shortfall because of COVID expenses. So that would take a grant, and that would require data that I'm not even sure is even available. So that's all I had to say.
I did have, Sarah, I did have one question for you. You concluded by just saying that, you know, the department is committed to following the research, making sure that Wisconsin policies are based on the best available information. This is kind of a pointed question, and maybe it's a little unfair. But is there something in the NTP that you see that raises red flags for community fluoridation? And really, that's at the heart of what the question that we're asking here. And I'm just wondering if you could try to take a stab at that. And like I said, maybe it's unfair for me to ask you that, but can you try to take a stab at that?
Sure. So I guess I'll say a couple of things in response. So number one, again, I know I've said this a lot. This is a draft. I personally, you know, as a scientist, I don't want to make a conclusion based on something that's a draft. We want things to go through peer review. We want to have scientific data. You know, I want to know that the federal government is like, you know, this is what they are in agreement with. You know, I am by no means an expert on fluoride toxicity, right? I look to those experts, you know, to draw conclusions. So what I presented to you is my take as a toxicologist for the state of Wisconsin. So that being said, I guess, you know, I could tell you what I think, and maybe I will, but I think, you know, you're a technical advisory committee, right? You're tasked with looking at this report, making this conclusion. I wanted to give you guys the tools and the things to consider when you're doing that, right? Each scientist you talk to is going to read this report, and they're going to see things that stand out differently to them. They're going to come to their own conclusions. Personally, as a toxicologist, the thing that stands out to me is this lack of dose-response relationship. You know, when they went in and tried to do that, they found 2 studies that they were able to use to do that analysis. I mean, is that enough scientific evidence to say yes or no? I guess you guys have to be the ones to make that decision for Madison. But 2 studies out of 339 studies in people, you know, again, as a toxicologist, as Jeff mentioned, like, we generally, and as Joe mentioned, you know, we and Andy, we generally try to use animal data to come up with a number, right? We use studies in people to figure out, what are we worried about? Like, where's the concern? And then we try to recreate that effect in our research animal, so we can say, we controlled for everything possible, and this is the line. We can't do that with this health effect or it hasn't been done yet. I'm not saying that we can't do it. It hasn't been done yet because of the specific health effect we're trying to look for. So I'm not saying, like, maybe there's a study that could be done in primates that could get to this question. You know, like, if you wanted to measure IQ, a lab rat probably isn't the right way to go. But these things take time and they take money. You know, a 2-year rat study costs millions of dollars. A several-year primate study is going to cost a lot of money. And so, we have to look at the weight of the evidence. What we know right now is that high levels of fluoride can cause health effects. We have seen associations with high levels of fluoride and several different types of health effects. But we are not consistently seeing those health effects at these lower concentrations. We don't have a study that is designed to answer that question right now. That was not what NTP was tasked with doing.
Sarah, thank you for taking a stab at that. I really appreciate that. And thank you for sharing all those various caveats. I understand I put you on the spot, and I appreciate you making an effort.
I seem to come to it's like the January meeting. I come when we talk about water, health stuff. So I think I was at the last January meeting, but we were in person. It's a little bit different now.
Right. Russ, you had a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what Sarah was saying, that, again, there was 2 studies, which is questionable, the validity of just 2 studies being able to use. And the key point is we still have to wait for NASEM to review this. So it's a draft, and we have not heard anything yet from the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. They need to make a determination as well before this goes from a draft to a concluded paper. So I just wanted to reemphasize again exactly what Sarah was saying. Thanks.
Dr. Anderson.
Yeah, I would just underscore that I think at least I personally, I don't think our committee is the one to decide whether you ought to fluoridate or not. Our job can be to look at, there's new information out, is that information that ought to be taken into account when a policy is developed. And then you have the Madison Health Department weighs in on health policy. The state does that well. And just because the National Academy and the NTP puts out a report and says, yes, there does seem to be some potential hazard here, that then needs to be translated into, is there a reason to change your current practices or not? And I think that would be, I would look to, and that's what I was asking, is the either Dane County or the State Health Department putting some thought into, if the NTP document doesn't change, what is your next step? I would say our committee is going to look at it, and if they say, well, like with the animal studies, there just isn't enough data there to say conclusively or give a level to it of is it likely or probable, or the way EPA does with documents, you could clearly arrive at a conclusion that the benefits of the teeth for dental caries outweighs the potential risks that are here. That isn't our committee call, I don't think. So I guess I'm going to propose to our committee that, as we said, we'd wait for the NTP. I don't see any big rush to interpret what they may do by our group, and I think I want to wait until they do, but I would like to hope that the state and the city county are coming up with, so how are you going to approach this, and what are you going to do when this does come out? And when, you could, I haven't heard that anybody's even approached any of the federal agencies for, is there potential funding to look at caries rates in various communities in Wisconsin, some that are fluoridated, not all of them are. So we have wide swaths that could be looked at. I don't know, Beth, if the university is potentially interested in looking at some type of study or not, but I would hope to be, we're not just going to wait until this comes out and then scramble to come up with a strategy. And I don't see that strategy being in the wait for the others on the committee to say, but that's not our bailiwick, I would say. we could say these studies seem to be good. There's a variety of them. Whether they can be used to develop a standard or not, that's really not our call. I think I mentioned some of that in the last meeting.
Jeff, I think I'm going to turn it over to you for the last word.
Well, I feel so honored. So, to address Henry's question a bit, I think once the NTP report got actually finalized, our next step at Public Health is we would take that into account and then also do a literature review to see if there's anything else that's been published since our last review, and do a deep dive, because one study, whether it's NTP or anything else, does not sway the conversation. It's the volume of research, right? And one thing I always say at these committee meetings, and I just want to beat it over the head again, is my concern about most of the studies that point to an IQ impact is that a lot of the social variables have not been adequately either addressed or even controlled. And there's a lot of underlying social issues like parents' IQ, poverty, diet, what's going on in the home. These things have known to been shown to impact the child's IQ. And if you don't control for that the best you can, the conclusions you draw, they're questionable.
Glad you're looking at it. That's all. I don't want to be our group left that you're waiting to hear what we're going to tell you to do, and I'm telling you it's your decision to make.
So here we are. We've more than spent the time that we had for this topic. So I wanted to thank folks from DHS for their participation and their presentation here, and thanks to Jeff from Public Health for also weighing in. We've got
Actually, the opportunity.
yeah. So we do have one other topic on the agenda, and I wanted to make sure that we at least touched on that to that one topic. Or that last topic. So we will definitely continue this conversation. There were a lot of items, a lot of questions or ideas that were raised. I think the important thing is that we're still looking at a draft report. And so those conclusions will need to wait until that peer review is complete and then the report is finalized.